we're here today to, we talk about sort of, economically what we've seen and what the outlook is. But and I want to kind of we bounce bullet points back and forth here, right? Like Jackson and I were kind of usually he throws out some topics that are kind of hot button things that he's seeing, and I want to go in order. So one of the first things that we brought up was there's been a lot of conversation over the last few years about the great farmland transition, and it kind of falls in line with the great wealth transfer as well, right? Where we're talking about a generational shift in economics, where you're looking at the old guard handing off to the new guard. And, we've seen all these reports on the great farmland transition. And one of the conversations that keeps happening is, will younger generations pick up the torch, or what's that going to look like? Or what's that transition going to look like? And so one of the talking points we decided to cover here today was, will it ever happen? What are we looking at? And so I guess that's the question I'm going to pitch back to you, Jackson, is will the great transition in farmland happen, and what is it looking like right now?
Yeah, it's a very dense question, right? To talk about sort of this massive, we talk 3 trillion in total value, the total value of the land and buildings on farmland across the country. So 3+ trillion. How does that turn over, and how has it turned over in the last, say, 5 years? Fortunately for us, we have a little bit of an advantage compared to maybe some other asset classes, because the USDA surveys farmers every 5 years and asks a lot of very detailed questions called the Ag Census. And we just got some results from the most recent Ag Census. So 2022 Ag Census year, the USDA released all those results earlier this year, back in February, and we're able to start to get a sense for what's happening with the demographics in agriculture. How are those things changing, and how might that lead to the transfer of wealth to the next generation, or will it result in sales of those assets that might free up and create more supply of farmland in the marketplace for any number of people? Could be other families who want to buy it, could be investors outside of farming who like the asset class. And I'll say the results from the 2022 Ag Census show that we were continuing to see that age, right, come into agriculture. We talk about it pretty much everywhere. You can talk about it in ag circles. It's farmers are getting older. You know it when you go to ag producer meetings and you kind of look around the room and you see more gray every year. You see that come through in the Ag Census. The average age of a farmer increased by a couple years after this most recent Ag Census. And you're seeing this like hollowing out of the farmer demographics. So you've got maybe a growing number of older farmers, so 65 plus, and you've got a growing number of younger farmers, 45 and under.
So when we're talking about this great transfer, the first question I wanted to ask you is whether we are talking strictly food producers, or are you looking at, and I kind of designate it as there's farmland and then there's ranch land. Are you looking at both, or is it strictly farm as in producing what would we say, plant-based food supply or plant-based commodities? I'm really kind of stumbling over this, but you get what I mean. Like, is it farm, or is it ranch, or is it both?
Yeah, it's both.
It's both. Okay,
it's both. So we're talking about the full 900 million acres of both cropland, so stuff that's growing, annual crops or permanent crops, perennials, trees, vines, those kind of things, as well as the ranch land that's out there housing, the millions of heartbeats in our livestock supply chain. Probably not so much when you go up the supply chain. So if you go to more of the food processing, right, there's more of a corporate mechanism in there. So it's not necessarily family held. So farmland, about 60% of it tends to be family held. It could be in trusts. So we're seeing more of those types of structures. So that's another indicator that maybe we're edging closer towards some transition in some of the ownership and operating of these assets. But there's still a lot of corporations. So an increasing percentage of corporation structures in farming operations themselves, which is telling me like, hey, like in that production space, in the land ownership space, still a vast majority of assets are owned at the individual or sole proprietor level, right? So 60%, 60 plus, it's coming down, but it's still a high percentage are owned by those individuals, and that's across cropland as well as pasture land. More of that in the further up you go, it's a lot more structured to persist depending on who's running it. So you could see ownership change and it would persist. It's either a trust or it's a corporation, but land itself still very, very much an individual asset.
So that was going to be my next question is, and I'm just, I'm really good at leveraging rumor on the street stuff, and that's why I'm not the economist, I'm the marketing guy. So the conversation keeps on happening that family farms, you have senior family members running the farm, and I'm just going to use farm to cover it so nobody throw anything at me listening. I'm going to use farm to cover agriculture in general. And this can be ranch and farm, right? So
yeah,
or I'll just say agricultural
farm
land.
and ranch.
We'll take the PC route here. So where the conversation keeps on going to, there are older agricultural landowners that are, kids don't want to pick up the torch and move on, and the hope is there that somebody else comes in and takes over, the ag land. And instead, the conversation keeps on going to the corporations are getting more and more of a stake or more capitalizing more of the market. Is that the case? Do we see that in the numbers? Like, is the percentage of individual ownership yielding to corporate investment groups, or is that it? Can we see that in the data?
Yes and no, but the reason why it's a yes and a no. So corporations are a larger percentage of controlled land and then the value of ag production. But most of those corporations are family held, right? So it's the family structuring as a corp for any number of tax reasons, for estate planning reasons, for, thinking about transition to other ownership, right? So they're deciding to structure as an LLC or a state corp or however they're trying to do it. So it's not what you think of. I think a lot of people, when they think corporations, are thinking, large conglomerate, multinational, sort of headless state organizations. But most of the corporations that we see in agriculture tend to be smaller hold sizes. They're more family controlled and family owned. And the organization structure is more of a business decision rather than hey, we're trying to exit and somebody else is coming in and buying all this land. Some of the surveys out there around land values and so I look at Illinois, right, has a great land survey. Iowa State does a good one. Purdue does one for Indiana. Some of the questions that they ask in these various surveys are like, well, what kinds of transactions are happening and who's buying them and why are they up for auction or for sale? You're starting to see an uptick in, hey, if someone's buying this, it's because of an exit, right? So a family's getting out and the person buying it is another farmer, right? So the number one reason is there's a farmer who's passing away or exiting farming for whatever reason, but the number one buyer of that land is another farmer in the area. So far, it has been largely a transition from one farmer to another farming entity. But there's a growing interest in other investors in the space, right? So you see maybe that start to tick up from low single digits to middle single digits in terms of the percent of transactions that are going to larger investor bases.
Right. And that's an important point to make is like, yes, corporations are buying land, but those corporations are just the business entity itself rather than, like you said, the kind of nameless, faceless beast that you have in your head of like the big corporate entity coming in to buy it out. But they're getting more of a stake at the table. I mean, it's food production, right? It's all business, right. And you're going to see some of that, but it's not as numerically as large as conversation may seem in that place. So, and if I'm hearing you right, when you're talking about the average age of agricultural landowners ticking up, it's that handoff is not necessarily happening right now. Is that something that's anticipated? Like, is there any way to even project that? I mean, because you're talking about conversations around the family dinner table. So is that something that you're kind of keeping a pulse on? And is that something that you're tracking or maybe projecting?
Yeah, it's almost like actuarial and kind of a very somber conversation. Like you don't want to think about like, well, we're all getting older. I mean, that's not a great conversation to have. But that is part of the math. Part of the calculus is you can only live so long, and the percentage of farmers who are over the age of 75 is continuing to increase. And so we saw a drop in the age range between 45 and 55. That percentage went down quite a bit in the most recent ag census, and then 65 and up increased quite a bit. So you're seeing the baby boomer generation kind of move through the farms and increase in age. So there's actuarially kind of what's going to happen in terms of life expectancies and sort of the transition of assets and decision making there. But what I think is more tangible from a data perspective is seeing how many more producers are working on the farm today. And the use of things like the trust or a corporation to establish younger producers in the business making or decision making process within the business. When you look at the percentage of farms with more than two operators or producers who are making that decision, we saw a pretty sizable increase between 2017 and 2022. That tells me that younger folks are kind of being brought into the operation, maybe taking over a part of it or working as a function, marketing, or doing CFO role or those kinds of things within the organization. Even if the primary is still an older, maybe head of household kind of thing, grandmom, granddad, kind of keeping the farm alive. They're bringing younger folks into the operation to start to learn the business and maybe eventually take over the business. So that's increasing. Even though we saw the overall count of farms go down, we saw a lot more farms with multiple operators in the 3, 4, and 5 range. The other piece of data that I look at is how many loans that we see where a trust is actually holding the land rather than mom, dad, grandmom, granddad, like the individuals, and that continues to increase as well. So we're seeing that land kind of move into entities that will survive and have sort of tax implications, and that tells me that people are thinking forward. They're looking at this and they're trying to structure their debt, which is probably going to outlive people like. I have a 30-year mortgage. Maybe I hope to make it 30 years, but a lot of this debt will extend beyond the life expectancy of many people. And they're thinking through, what does that mean? How do I protect the asset? How do I protect the future business owners? And I'm seeing that accelerate out there in the marketplace.